Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Justice Redesign in episode 2 in our series, a conversation with Pastor Edward Palmer on implicit bias, DEI backlash, and the struggle for true equity. Now, if you joined us for episode 1, you heard Pastor Edward Palmer, nationally recognized diversity trainer, a military veteran, and a juvenile justice reform leader, share the story of his life's work confronting implicit bias and reducing racial disparities in justice and child welfare systems. Today, we're going to shift our focus to what Pastor Palmer calls the most troubling trend he's seen in decades, the anti-DEI movement, a deliberate campaign to silence the very language that allows us to fight discrimination. This episode is titled The Anti-DEI Shift, Silencing the Language of Justice. And we're going to be asking these critical questions of Pastor Palmer. Why has that is Pastor Palmer's request for technical assistance dried up under the new administration? And what happens when acknowledging race and policy is suddenly labeled racist? And how do we meaningfully address racism if we're no longer allowed to say the word race? And what are the real-world consequences on the ground, in the courtrooms, in classrooms, in communities, when systems are forbidden from using words like equity, inclusion, or disparities? Ladies and gentlemen, these are not rhetorical questions. These are the battlegrounds of modern civil rights. And Pastor Palmer, who's led national training efforts that have even been validated by Johns Hopkins University, is the voice we need to guide us through the fog. So let's go ahead and dive in. I want to shift here, okay, and talk about the anti-DEI shift. What kind of goes to the heart of this one, the silencing what I call the language of justice, okay?
Mm-hmm.
You've said publicly that requests for your expertise have slowed dramatically since the current administration took office.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe what changed?
Well, I had a little bit of pushback in the first first administration. Um, I had a big pickup during the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery era, and then there was these anti-DI policies that came out towards the end of the first term, and I started getting cancellations of contracts. Well, this last term, it started right away. So I had a contract with a national organization. It was a pretty good contract. The biggest thing for me was it allowed me an opportunity to travel the country and work with jurisdictions on systemic issues. And a week after the inauguration, I got a call that said, "Hey, we're going to have to put that on hold because we don't know what's going to happen with federal funding. We're getting some noise that, hey, anything dealing with racial and ethnic disparities is going to be cut." And so, of course, this organization was hit heavy. And so that was just one contract. And then there are jurisdictions that call us regularly. They call us regularly to come in and do work. You and I partnered on some of that work, and yet those calls are not coming. And even when you send an email to reconnect and encourage them to think about you on their agenda, well, we're not going to be doing DEI work this year, or we're not going to have our DEI conference. I was just doing a conference with a nice national organization that both you and I are familiar with, and they had their annual racial and ethnic disparity conference, but it wasn't called a racial and ethnic disparity conference. And as one of the presenters, I presented a title for my session, and it was going to be "Do DEI Even If You Can't Say It." And I was immediately told that would affect registrations because many jurisdictions have been outlawed from coming to conference that have the course descriptions that deal with diversity, equity, inclusion, or racial equity. And so I had to come up with a more organic conversation with stakeholders about the use of data, as opposed to digging right in and confronting racial inequities. So yes, it has impacted me tremendously. And so every opportunity I get to do work, I've been doing a lot of pro bono work this year. It's interesting how because folks are can't spend dollars on this work, and yet they're still calling and saying, "Can you talk with our university criminal justice class on racial equity and things like that?" And so I've been able to still do the work, um, but not as broadly as I've been able to do it in the past. And folks are just not able to make investment in bringing folks in to help them have these, challenging conversations around racial equity. So it's been difficult.
And the reason I wanted to ask you that question is because it's been pretty disturbing to me. Um, because going back to your description, of the approach and your response to my question about what outcomes have you seen as a result of your training and people embracing it. I have been positively impacted by your training because
Mhm.
I know that I've received requests from my technical assistance team on the school to help communities create and develop their own school justice partnership. Um, were there and they brought up that they recently had you in to provide implicit bias training. Okay.
Mhm.
And so the next question was, and by the way, you mentioned the school justice partnership and Judge Teskey and as examples of how a system through exclusionary disciplinary policies, how negatively it impacts kids of color.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but here's the thing is that, they were calling me because, what they heard from you, okay, and how you delivered it in such a comfortable, safe way, but yet very impactful, was the reason they were reaching out to me, not just because you mentioned school justice. It was because they told me they walked out of your training more driven to address, racial disparities that can be the result of, albeit on the surface, very innocent people who want to do well, realizing maybe I'm not doing so well.
Mhm.
And that's how much they care about kids, that they want to better themselves, they want to better their system. So that I want my listeners to understand, okay, you know, that what's really happening here when we temper and tamper down and soften, okay, to the point that can we really talk about the best ways to ensure that systems don't unintentionally, hurt kids of color, let's say in a juvenile justice system or school system, if you can't really talk about the real issues around race. And so it brings me to this question. This administration now argues that acknowledging race in policy is itself racist. So I don't know. I mean, how do you respond to this, what I call turning civil rights on its head, this inversion of civil rights logic? How do you respond to this inversion of civil rights logic?
Well, the way I approach this, the only way you can really embrace the idea that to consider race in policy and the impact of race in policy is in itself racist. You have to deny 250 plus years of slavery. You just have to say it never happened. You have to deny over 100 plus years of Jim Crow and segregation laws. You have to say that we've always been a people who believed in fairness and equality, and we effectuated that in all of our policies and practices. And we've always treated people the same and given people the same access and opportunity. You have to just ignore and live in some utopia, fantasy world that's perfect, and that's just not the case. We have lived most, if not all, of our history in this space of legalized discrimination and oppression of people based on how they look. and it's been every group that has migrated has had to go through some form of oppression and discrimination based on their ethnicity, whether it's being Polish, being German, being Italian, being Jewish, right? But we and the indigenous people are the only folks who didn't migrate here. You know, the indigenous people lived here when our white forefathers got here, and black people were kidnapped and brought here, right? And so how do we deal with these populations and live together in harmony, right? So all of these movements to level the playing field, to acknowledge that history, and to try to make better choices to create the nation that we to form that more perfect union, right? Is being turned upside down with this argument that just totally ignores the reality of our history, right? And so I just say that that's asinine. That doesn't make sense. That's an argument that again just totally ignores um, our history as a nation. So yeah,
Yeah, I mean, we still have the Civil Rights Act. We still have the Voting Rights Act. We still have laws that say, that we cannot discriminate based upon race, sex, and now sexual orientation, religion, gender. Okay. So it's like, oh, okay, we have laws that say we can't do it, but now we have an administration who says that we're actually discriminating if we talk about race. And yet, so let me ask you this, Pastor, how do we meaningfully address racism? Because I think you've already answered the question. I want to make sure I covered everything here in this. How do we meaningfully address racism if we can't even say the word race?
right. So one of the things I typically do with organizations is I start with the data, right? And it's like you don't want to talk about race, so let's talk about what the data talks about. Let's talk about what the data says to us, right? And I talk about this and could try to connect the data analysis that we do on any system. You talked about that state that you and I trained in together, right? That data said a lot about how kids are treated in their system. All other populations compared to white populations, 4 to 1, 7 to 1, right? And the worst outcomes, right? That's what the data says, right? But then here's where I get on. What does your mission say? What does your vision say? Now, just as I've not gone to any Fortune 500 companies, no 501c3 nonprofit corporations, no government agencies where their mission statement states that we want the best possible outcome for white kids and the worst possible outcome for black kids. Their mission statement says we want all kids to thrive. We want all kids to be rehabilitated, have access to supports and services that will enable them to thrive as productive adults, right? Whatever those statements says, I said, so this is a great outcome. This is a great endeavor. However, your data shows that we're succeeding in some areas and we're not succeeding in others. So let's just focus on this great mission, this great vision you have, and let's focus on looking at the data and let the data show us where we're falling short. And I try to come in through that side exit and kind of side interest rather, and try to get them to think about the goal and intentions of their agency and really use that mission and vision statement to focus them on, we're failing this community. We're failing this group of kids, and the data shows us that our system is not producing the same opportunities and access to services that we want for certain kids. Our system is not giving certain kids the opportunity. One of the things we had to deal with here in our state was the disproportionate access to diversion opportunities, which was intended to keep kids out of court. And if you can keep kids out of court, you can most likely keep them out of the detention center. And again, you can most likely increase that graduation rate and all those other positive things that happen. But disproportionately, black kids were being overwritten. They were being denied access to diversion. So we focused on that. And we focused on what were the policies and practices in individual jurisdictions that were creating these disparate outcomes. And we talked to prosecutors and helped them to understand that we know you're doing a good job. We know you want the best for your kids, but here's what your data shows. And we were able to get some significant changes. We had the Jefferson County, which is Louisville, Kentucky. That prosecutor changed his policy, and his disproportionate rate of overriding diversion for Black kids dropped over 90%, from overriding 1,000 kids down to less than 100. That's a whole lot of kids getting access to diversion and avoiding that court door. So I try to focus on, let's you don't want to talk about race, I'm fine. Let's talk about what the data talks about. And let's talk about your mission. Let's talk about your vision. And I use the two to kind of engage them in doing what's going to be best for their kids. And here's the good news, Judge, is that in Kentucky, we found that every policy change we made to get better outcomes for Black kids exponentially gave better outcomes to white kids. So if we were able to get 5 or 6 positive percentage points in the right direction for Black kids, we got 15 or 20 for white kids. So when we lift up the system and make it more equitable for Black kids, we lift the system up for all kids.
Yeah, and I call that vicarious results. They can be bad, they can be good. What you just described is good. And it also reflects how much we are all human and together on this, regardless of the way we look, the color of our skin. Whoever benefits, the others can benefit, unless you have a system that literally says, and that Plessy versus Ferguson allowed, separate but equal facilities. And you have laws like Jim Crow that prevent that from happening. But once you remove those type of laws, then a system is freer to have a conversation about benefiting, and even if it's benefiting one, in this case, wanting to raise positive outcomes for African American kids who have historically, because there's no question about it, slavery, Jim Crow, as you opened up with, okay, has put African Americans in a deep hole. I mean, they were not allowed to read. They were not allowed to write. That was, we don't want educated slaves now, okay, because they might rebel against us, okay? But then all of a sudden, if we think Brown versus Board of Education reverses Plessy, we get the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, that all of a sudden, just because we got those laws, Black people are now equal with us? Well, no, not economically, not in housing, because they were in a hole,
Right. Yeah.
and there are still many trying to get out of the hole, which brings me to poverty, because another thing that you're mentioning is getting into the weeds. And if you can so in this new thing where you can't bring up race,
Right.
you're getting creative, so you show the numbers. So it sounds to me, and tell me yes or no, that you're not saying it, but I can imagine that if you show the numbers, eventually it comes up with somebody in the audience.
Exactly. That's exactly what I do. I talk about their mission. I compliment them on their mission, on the hard work that they do, and then I show them what the data shows. And oftentimes, system folks have this data. Folks doing the work day by day and seeing the disproportionate populations at the various contact points haven't really seen the data. And when they actually get an opportunity to look at it, they go, wow. And ultimately, they bring up race or racism. And then, it's open. We can talk about it now because you brought it up, not me.
Yeah. So, and you've touched on this, and actually you've touched on it pretty well, but I'm going to ask this question anyway, just to play safe in case there may be an additional perspective to add on it you could offer. But in your experience, what happens on the ground when a system is forbidden from using terms like equity, inclusion, or disparities? And the reason I think this question is important, you've just described how your approach has had to change. You can't bring up race, okay? And you are now, and now that particularly government, public institutions receive grant money in DEI, anything related to race that's in anything, in any grant, is not going to be allowed. So there's no monies now going to this type of training. Okay.
Mhm.
So now you're doing it pro bono for the time being. Okay. Um, you're doing having to do it differently. All right. So you've now explained the approach, but um, and it's certainly appears to be an effective approach under circumstances.
Mhm.
But regardless of that, w- you know, between what you're having to do now and how you did it before, where it was more direct, okay, what has been your experience when this present system is forbidding terms like equity, inclusion, and disparities?
I think what I'm seeing in the field, I'm hearing from folks, I do attend national meetings, is that one, the workforce is becoming desensitized to the disparate outcomes and the harm that they're doing on kids. And a lot of folks are just trying to make it to that golden day of retirement. And so they're having to, go into the work and open that glove box and put their humanity in their glove box and then go in there and do what the system is designed to do. And I'm running into a lot of folks who are frustrated because they see these disparities, they see these inequitable treatment of kids, black and brown kids in the system, and yet they're in an environment where they're penalized for trying to do things that will address these issues. And so I see a lot of frustration at the ground level. I see a lot of going along to get along kind of approaches, and people are becoming desensitized. People who were once allies in this conversation that would call me often and have conversations with me are not calling so often. And even when I see them in passing and bring up the subject, I can tell that there's an avoidance to kind of having this conversation because we're in a new environment. New policymakers are on board, and they're not willing to talk about that. And we're having some pushbacks here in Kentucky to groundbreaking legislation on juvenile justice. And now we want to go back to the good old days where you just treat kids like you treat adults. In fact, the author of this upcoming legislation, he started it, a conversation with policymakers and advocates with why do we treat kids differently than we do adults. Of course, this man is not a lawyer, and he has no ideal concept what the Supreme Court has said about that issue. But yet he wants to present a piece of legislation that will undo all the advancements that we have seen in Senate Bill 200 that was enacted in 2014. So on the ground level, I see a lot of frustration. I see a lot of desensitizing to the issues, and folks don't want to, rock the boat.
Yeah. So, and do you come across folks like that, the ones who kind of shy away, that that it's not that they don't want to talk about it; they're scared to talk about it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so you have an administration who's saying flat out, you're forbidden from talking about race, equity, the whole diversion, equity and inclusion. But even though they're saying it, okay, doesn't necessarily mean that there's not the desire for it. It's still
Oh,
there.
right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Folks are
yeah.
still interested in this work, and I think there are some folks in the field who, when given the opportunity and enough built-in discretion, they're doing what they can to create those equitable outcomes. But it's tough as they ratchet down the policy piece to make sure that they minimize that discretion and forces people on a from a policy standpoint to make decisions that are disproportionately and negatively affecting black and brown communities.
Well, that brings us to the end of episode 2 of a conversation with Pastor Edward Palmer on implicit bias, DEI backlash, and the struggle for true equity. Today, we explored what happens when language itself becomes the battleground. when simply naming race or equity is treated as a threat rather than a solution. Pastor Palmer has helped us see that denying the words doesn't erase the problem. In fact, it reinforces it. But what happens when that pushback isn't just rhetorical, but personal? In episode 3, titled Personal Impact, From Invitations to Silence, we'll step into Pastor Palmer's shoes and examine what it feels like when decades of hard-earned credibility are met with a closed door. We'll ask, what is the emotional and professional toll of this institutional silence? And is this silence rooted in fear, political calculation, or something even deeper? And is Pastor Palmer alone in this experience? Or is it that this is part of a larger national pattern? Look, if episode 2 was about erasing the message, episode 3 is about erasing the messenger. So join us for that conversation next time on Justice Resign. In the meantime, take care and be safe.